thank you very much, Hanny. We can see how everything is joining up, and the importance of implementation. The fact that women are not appointed in conflict mediation by international and national interlocutors. The fact that there are women in higher numbers in peace processes where the UN is not involved is something which is a challenge, and women are often not invited to these debates. Shows that the whole issue of even passing resolutions and having national action plans is not an end in itself. The important thing is implementation and reporting back, and I suppose that's the stage at which Ireland is now. And I think we need to mark up some of the kind of the leadership ends. It is interesting that May Robinson from here is the first special envoy at the UN level. Also, I was involved with the Department of Foreign Affairs in leading on the cross-learning process between Liberia, Timor-Leste and Ireland that fed into the National Action Plan, and Ireland was the first country, I believe, to appoint its own special envoy on 1325, who was Baroness Nuala O'Lone, which was really revolutionary at that time as well. The fact that there's a monitoring group made up of CSOs as well as departments, and I assume, could I ask people just to turn off their mobile phones? Ringing away. Oh, I've now embarrassed one of our speakers. I should have kept quiet. Yeah, and I suppose when we're talking, and Liz referred to the issue about the publication hard copy, and I know it's also going to go on the website of the mid-term review and progress report, and just think Ireland will be the second country have done that, and I'm sure that augurs well for the final progress report and review and ongoing, so opening up the transparency debate. But you know, there's a chiming, and I'm sure my colleague Karen McMinn wouldn't mind me referring to this, about the evidence base. I mean, Ambassador Anderson talked about the empirical evidence collection being extremely important, and Avla talked the work that Avla and the Women's Resource and Development Agency and the National Women's Council are doing will collect some of that evidence base. But I mean, we had a graphic description there from Hanny about how it was important to build up this evidence base, both with case studies and the systematic collection of data. And let me say, we're finding the same thing in the Irish National Action Plan. You have to start somewhere. It's only when you actually do it you realise what you haven't got and what you haven't done, and it's actually about learning how to do it as we are going along, and I think that's important. And the importance is that the indicators, whether it's in a national action plan or on a global base, provide an accountability framework. It does help us to get there, as long as we don't start regarding it as a tick box exercise, and we understand, as Hanny has said, that there's more complexity underneath that we have to add to, and the richness and the importance. So we had the participation, the lack of women's participation. We know about the gender-based violence and the issue about mainstreaming. Hanny referring to, and I know the Ambassador and Ireland's mission to the UN has been doing this, about how you don't just raise it as special resolutions and actions on gender which provide the drive, but it's about mainstreaming it. So it's taking it in to the Peacebuilding Committee in the UN and saying, yeah, we're going to start with a target of 15% for women and we're going to grow from there. So, you know, we can see evidence of that being mainstreamed as well. So thank you very much, Hanny, for that. Final speaker in this morning's session is Giulia Pasquinelli. She's the Policy Officer at the European Peacebuilding Liaison Office, EPLO for short. EPLO is the platform of European NGOs, NGO frameworks and think tanks which are committed to peacebuilding and the prevention of violent conflict. It aims to influence the EU to promote and implement measures which lead to sustainable peace. EPLO has a Gender, Peace and Security Working Group which promotes the inclusion of a gender perspective and the meaningful participation of women in European peace, security, policy and practice. And Giulia's own work focuses on gender, peace and security, EU accession process and peace building, as well as EU support to the peace processes. You're very welcome.
Thank you, Bruna, for this introduction. And let me also thank Melanie and her team for organizing this very timely event and for giving me the opportunity to share with you some of our experience in Brussels and contribute to the discussion, and also to learn from all of you today. I'm really looking forward to the discussion afterwards, by the way, so I'll try to be short. As Bruna said, I'm a policy officer at the European Peacebuilding Liaison office. I coordinate the working group on gender, peace and security, which aims at promoting the inclusion of a gender perspective, but also meaningful participation of women in European Union policies and practices on peace and security. In my presentation, I will just very briefly introduce EU policies on 1325 and subsequent resolutions, and then look at the stages of implementation of these policies, but then focusing mostly on the challenges and opportunities for the EU and its member states to actually push forward the implementation. In terms of policies and strategies, as it has been already mentioned, Europe is a very interesting case to look at because it is home to the majority of national action plans that have been published, 17 of which come from EU member states. The latest one was adopted by Germany a few months ago, and as you probably all know, Germany has been resistant for quite a long time to adopting one, and we can also discuss why later if you're interested. The EU adopted a very clear and comprehensive strategy on 1325 in 2008 with two documents. One is called the EU Comprehensive Approach to 1325 and 1820. And the second one is an operational document which looks at how these resolutions are integrated and implemented through EU common security and defense policy missions. The comprehensive approach is called that way and is not called action plan because the EU intended to have a policy that complements what member states already have or are developing in terms of national action plan, and not to substitute these policies. In terms of implementation, some very interesting initiatives came out from the adoption of the comprehensive approach, including the establishment of an interinstitutional task force on women, peace and security, and a yearly exchange among EU member states on implementation of 1325 and subsequent resolutions. The task force also adopted a number of indicators to measure progress in the implementation of these strategies, and the first monitoring report was released in 2011. The report highlights good practices and innovative approaches developed by the EU and its member states, and including supporting to donor coordination networks in conflict-affected countries on 1325, the development, of course, of national action plans in conflict-affected countries where the EU is active and engaged. The integration of women, peace and security resolutions in its political dialogue with third countries, particularly with fragile states and conflict-affected and post-conflict countries. But also the development and provision of training on gender and human rights to EU staff, not only in the headquarters, but also staff that is being deployed to common security and defense policy missions, which are the civilian and military missions of the European Union. But also, of course, very importantly, funding to civil society organizations, including women's groups, on a range of different issues, including women's active participation in democratic processes and political participations, capacity building for civil society organizations to engage in peace processes, etc. This is being channeled mainly through two funding instruments that the European Union has, which is the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights and the Instrument for Stability, which is, as we call it, the Peacebuilding instrument. But also the integration of gender dimensions, and particularly the prevention and the protection pillar into common security and defense policy missions, shortly CSDP missions, I will be calling them now. But also let's not forget that gender equality and non-discrimination, but also the prevention of violence against women and combating trafficking are some of the political criteria that countries that aim to access the European Union and become members of the European Union have to comply with. These are part of the so-called Copenhagen criteria. So these are just few of the examples that are included and analyzed in the report from 2011 that show the kind of engagement that the EU has on 1325 and its subsequent resolutions. Of course, all of these are not without challenges. And the report itself identifies some of them, including difficulties in the collection of data from the EU member states, but also from the various parts of the EU that contributed to the report, including EU delegations, CSDP missions, and particularly for one indicator, I will mention this because Hani mentioned it, so I think it might be interesting. One of the indicators is supposed to monitor the number and percentage of women mediators and negotiators, but also women civil society groups involved in formal and informal peace processes. And the report shows that despite the fact that EU and several member states have reported supporting peace processes across the globe, the number of women's representations in these peace negotiations is unknown. So we hope that this will change with the next monitoring report, which is due in 2013. So certainly this missing data is something that is very important for us to reflect on. What I would like to do now is just to focus on some of the challenges that we observe and also the opportunities, to end with a positive note, hopefully. First of all, I would mention the risk that the EU's approach, and as it is often also with national action plans, simply focuses on a list of activities that are carried out rather than the impact of these activities, and this has been already mentioned by the previous speakers. Some of the progress that I mentioned before that is analyzed in this monitoring report is in large part what we would call bureaucratic progress. So for instance, also, I don't know, the appointment of gender advisors to CSDP missions. The primary objective of the resolutions, however, was to transform the relationship between women and security and women and peace. And of course, by limiting the analysis and the monitoring to the number of scope and scope of the activities that are related to the implementation of 1325, we really fail to capture this impact. So for these reasons, we as EPLO have been advocating for a result-focused approach to be reflected also in adequate monitoring mechanisms, which would need to have qualitative and not just quantitative indicators, as it is the case now for the EU indicators. The second challenge that I would like to mention is the change of the organizational culture of the European Union. The gender, peace and security agenda tends to be, in large part, a personality-driven agenda, pushed forward by committed individuals at various levels, including, of course, the High Representative for Security Policy, Catherine Ashton. However, mechanisms to really integrate 1325 into EU external action are currently far from being automatic. Gender advisors are, for instance, not often consulted prior to the planning and then deploying of a CSDP missions, but only appointed once a mission has been deployed. Consultations with women from and in conflict affected countries is not happening on a regular basis, when it is happening at all. In addition, the European External Action Service, which is, let's say, the diplomatic service of the European Union, which was established a couple of years ago, reflects the underrepresentation of women at the highest levels in the ministries of foreign affairs of the member states. And this is something that also it's important to note. A better gender balance at senior level and a specific attention on training, not only on gender and human rights, but specifically on 1325, is really needed. And also the integration of specific tasks and responsibilities for the implementation of the resolutions at every level of the European Union, and mainly of the European External Action Service. The third challenge that I would like to mention has to do with the way 1325 is framed within the organizational structure of the European Union. In the last few years, we've witnessed a progressive absorption of 1325 into the women's rights agenda and hence the human rights agenda in the EU organizational structure. Yet 1325 is not just about women's rights. It's about understanding the extent to which gender-based disparities in conflicts between men and women shape their immediate needs and their long-term interests, and the way they contribute to peace processes. 1325 also helps us to challenge traditionally state-centered and male-dominated concepts of security, and introducing alternative, more inclusive and less top-down approaches. For this reason, 1325 needs to be placed into the security agenda rather than the human rights agenda. Otherwise, this dimension gets lost, as does the idea that women are not just another minority whose rights must be considered, but a majority grouping whose participation to peace and security policies and practices is still largely missing. I will now mention 3 opportunities for the European Union and its member states to really push forward the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. The first one, I would say, is capitalizing, learning, and sharing from its own experience of conflict and peacemaking, and the experience of the member states in this regard. The EU itself is considered to be a successful peace project. We all know about the fact that the European Union was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize earlier this year. Which was not uncontroversial, by the way. Successes and failures of resolving conflicts within its own borders should be shared more widely and inform some of the new thinking on how the EU can support meaningful participation of women in peace processes. EU member states have themselves, in some cases, are still experiencing conflicts within their own borders, and have also gone through very successful peace processes, although, of course, peace processes never concluded. Member states, as we said, are also leading the way with the number and quality of their national action plans on women, peace and security. They also happen to be the key decision makers on common foreign and security policy. They propose candidates for top positions in the European Union, including in the European External Action Service. They second personnel to CSDP missions, and they provide them with pre-deployment training, in some cases on gender and 1325, in most cases not. They legislate on women quotas in parliament. They also prosecute sexual and gender-based violence. In short, member states have an enormous contribution to give to EU policymaking when it comes to EU support to peace processes and broadly EU external action. And their experience should be brought more consistently into EU policymaking. One of the frameworks in which this could happen is this EU task force on women, peace and security, which, according to our analysis, is currently being underutilized by member states. And it could become a much more strategic framework for the member states. The second opportunity is consulting more broadly and widely with civil society, including women from and in conflict-affected countries. It has already been said that civil society organizations, including women's groups in fragile, conflict-affected and post-conflict countries, continue to play vital roles in support to conflict prevention and peace building, and also reconciliation efforts. Yet their voices very rarely inform policy planning and decision-making at EU level. Systematic consultation mechanisms in place have proven very beneficial at EU level. For instance, many local civil society women's groups feed their input into the annual progress reports that the EU publishes for the EU accession policy. And this has been considered a very successful framework for consultation for civil society organizations and for them to have a voice in this process as well. The EU has recently acknowledged the need for an enhanced and more strategic approach with civil society organizations in a recent consultation, in a recent communication that was released in September 2012 on engagement with local civil society organizations. The third one, and my last point, would be about the need for the EU to be leading by example. And with this, I'd like to go back also to the question of gender balance in the European External Action Service. Equality between men and women is among the founding principles of the European Union. However, when it comes to percentages of men and women in senior level positions in the European External Action Service, the numbers are extremely low. And as I said, they also reflect the underrepresentation of women at the highest levels in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the member states. In the upcoming review of the European External Action Service, which will take place in June this year, the High Representative should also address issues regarding the geographic and gender balance in the European External Action Service. And the regulation establishing this new institution also suggests that additional specific measures to correct possible imbalances could be proposed. In my organization, in a recent statement, we've noted that the ruling out of quota when the institution was established was unfortunate. And it is particularly so now that we see the scant results achieved by the current system, which, while in name merit-based, is failing to yield anything close to gender equality. And also, data shows that quotas as temporary measures hold the best hope for leveling the playing fields in this area, as was mentioned already today. Against this background, we have recommended the EES, the European External Action Service Management, and the member states to reconsider their positions on the adoption of women quotas for the European External Action Service senior and decision-making levels as temporary measures to overcome the current impasse. I think I will leave it at that, but maybe at some point during the discussion we could go back to the role of Ireland in its rotating presidency and opportunities also for Ireland in this scope to really push for the implementation of 1325. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Giulia. We're back to talking about those issues that we start with implementation, like appointment of gender advisors, but that could end up just as a bureaucratic appointment, when actually what we're really talking about is transformational change. And the whole issue being about results focused and finding ways of responding in that complex way that Hanny was talking about, quantitative indicators but also qualitative indicators. And of course the whole issue is about culture change, and it's about whole institution change. We have seen committed leaders, not alone Ambassador Anderson and at the permanent mission in the UN and in other countries, leading this change, but it can't rely on committed individuals. It's about institutionalising that. It's about institutionalising that. And Giulia finished with a number of opportunities in the EU about how we can push this agenda forward, with the challenge of maybe some people will raise the whole issue of the EU presidency. So we've had the conflict here in Ireland. We've had examples of conflict in other countries. We've looked at the regional as UN. We've looked at what we're doing in Ireland, what we're doing in the region at the UN, the challenges at the UN and the framework that's been sent, and tying that all up with Ireland's input at the UN level, and the reference to the fact that Ireland is also inputting and has the presidency now at the European regional level.